Hi, so this is Verbal and Nonverbal Messages, Interplay, chapters 5 and 6. So the nature of language, we're going to look at first chapter 5, and an overview of that is that language is symbolic and subjective, language is rule-governed, and we'll look at language and worldview. So to begin, with the idea that language is symbolic, if you look in your text on page 143, it talks about linguistic theorists Ogden and Richards and the triangle of meaning. So the idea is that meanings are in people and not in words, but we try to explain something, a thought that the user has, and when we are explaining those thoughts that the user has, we attach it to a symbol, and that symbol is referring to a particular thing. And for very concrete things, like a table, the actual wood table, that actual thing is the referent, and the word table is the symbol. So for concrete things, it's not always, it's pretty easy to understand what the user or what the thought is really referencing. And it's easy for us to make sense of it. But when we have something that's more subjective, such as the word feminism, the word love, then it becomes a lot more difficult to understand what the intention or what the speaker was actually trying to refer to. So some reference are abstract, like love, and others aren't even nouns. It could be, I feel angry or I am excited. And it's just, and that would be the referent is that feeling or emotion that the word or the symbol is trying to make sense of. So the real key there is that the meaning itself resides within the people and all of the prior experiences that that person has had, and the symbol or the words, that understanding takes place whenever we have an overlap in prior experience. Your textbook talks about different types of rules that help to make up how we understand language. The first is phonological rules, and phonological rules govern how sounds are combined to form words. For instance, the words champagne, double, and occasion have the same meaning in different languages, but they're pronounced differently because the languages have different phonological rules. So if you took Hooked on Phonics or something similar, then you would understand phonological rules. Most of the time people pick up on those phonological rules just in the process of learning a language, but oftentimes teachers have to focus especially on the way that things are pronounced and the way that things sound. So you take a course in phonics or sounding out words. Syntactical rules are the ways that words are arranged, like your sentence structure, where your commas, where your periods should go. And when we look at the way that those symbols or those words are arranged, we're looking at a syntactic rule. Semantic rules are in the way that we develop relationships with words and their meanings. Syntax deals with sentence structure. Semantics deals with the meanings of the words. Semantic rules are what make it possible for us to agree that bikes are for riding and books are for reading. But then sometimes if I say bike, you might think of a bicycle. And others, if I say the word bike, you might think of a motorcycle, depending on how it's used. And so that's where pragmatic rules often come into play. So pragmatic rules tell us what use and interpretation of a message is appropriate within a given context. So if I'm talking with children and I say, oh, he rode his bike to school, then you probably think of a bicycle. But pragmatically speaking, if I talk about a college student and I'm like, yeah, he rode his bike to school, and if he has a certain look about him, then you might assume, based pragmatically, that the bike would be a motorcycle. So there are certain ways that we interpret things according to our language and our surroundings, and that would be based on our pragmatic rules. So, people in individual relationships also create their own set of pragmatic rules. For example, if for a lot of people, when they text message, if you get a response that says K, just the letter K, then it can be seen offensively. Other people, you text back a K and they think, oh, yeah, that means okay. I can tell you right now, if I send a K to my best friend, she interprets that as a very offensive response. It's not sensitive. And so the pragmatic rules that have been developed within that friendship indicate that this is an unacceptable response. It means that I'm angry. We also develop pragmatic rules with email messages, with text, and other things. So if you use all caps, it's considered cussing or an insult, some kind of it's like sending a lot of exclamation marks. So our pragmatic rules also determine the way that we interpret text. Semantics. So taking in a little bit of a closer look at semantics, which I think is very interesting. Basically, semantics is the study of the relationship between words and their meanings. And so we know that words have different connotations and denotations, right? So a denotation, we'll start with that one. A denotation is a dictionary's definition. It's pretty concrete. It's exactly what that word means according to the dictionary. But our connotations are all the excessive baggage that go along with that word. They're all of the implied meanings that go with the word. And so we may have a house, a home, or a living accommodation, and a house may have a particular denotation. A home, on the other hand, that's where our heart is, and so it has a more positive connotation. A living accommodation certainly doesn't have that same connotation, that warmth or friendliness that a home would have. A boss, a superior, management, a supervisor, boss tends to have a more informal connotation. If something is cheap or inexpensive, if you give me a Valentine's Day gift, it may be inexpensive but thoughtful, but it shouldn't be cheap. A lawyer, an attorney, a legal representative, or a quiz, a test, examination, or a midterm, they carry with them different connotations, although sometimes a quiz can hold just as much weight as an exam, but we certainly think of a midterm as being weightier or heftier. The connotation of it is more intense than a quiz or a test. So within semantics, we often come up with euphemisms. A euphemism is the substitution of an agreeable or inoffensive expression for one that may offend or suggest something unpleasant. So if it sounds harsh, we come up with another way to say it so that it doesn't have that same harshness to it. For example, instead of saying the person committed murder, we might say that they were neutralized. We neutralized the subject. Or often politicians, instead of admitting that they lied, they will place the blame or defer the blame, and they'll say that they misspoke, or perhaps not even that they misspoke, but maybe you misinterpreted their statement. We might not steal from the office supply cabinet, we may appropriate from, or more commonly, we'll say we borrowed it and never returned it. But it's harsh to say that something was stolen. We might say instead of someone is poor, they're economically disadvantaged, or instead of saying that someone is homeless, they are temporarily displaced. We have all different ways of saying something, but we use whatever language, whatever semantics are given to us. When we consider language and worldview, we understand that different languages have different words that are necessary to represent a common idea. We can all understand these ideas when we use different languages, but certain languages develop and words develop for a particular area based on the needs of that region. For example, there may be 1,000 words for reindeer. I provided the link for the Washington Post. There are really 50 Eskimo words for snow in the discussion board. And the idea that there would need to be 50 words for snow and that Inuits would use lots of words for the word ice have developed because they have lots of different conditions for ice or snow. Whereas here in the South, we may not need those many words to describe whatever precipitation is falling in the cold. The second link, the Filipinos are obsessed with rice, is no longer an active link, but the idea that there are 7 different words for rice is still there, and certainly those words for rice don't include different types of rice meals that you could create and make. The idea that people view the world based on their lexical terms and grammatical structures is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It forms from 2 different concepts. One, linguistic determinism, the idea that our language tells us how to think. And the second idea, from linguistic relativism, which is that people who speak different languages will see the world differently. It's a very interesting concept. The idea is that people who are bilingual or trilingual, or even the idea that if you learn something in one language, it may not translate well into another language. There may be a way for you to be able to have those same feelings and emotions, of course, and we understand time, we understand past tense and future tense, no matter what your language is. But the way that our brains think around those concepts is largely determined based on the way that we use language. For example, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was based on this idea that the Hopi Native Americans represented a view of reality that was drastically different from other tongues. So Hopi language said that there was no distinction between nouns and verbs. People who spoke it described the entire world as being constantly in process. English speakers used nouns to characterize people or objects as being fixed or constant, but the Hopi language represents them more as verbs constantly changing. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has been disproven in some cases, has been encouraged in other ideas and ways by saying that we focus on the things that our language allows us to focus on. We develop a language that helps us to notice certain things. Your textbook looks on page 144 and 145 at terms for that words in different languages that mean something specific to that language. And so you can take a look at those. There are certainly a lot of videos and places that you can read more about linguistic relativism. I think it's an amazingly interesting concept, and it's certainly one that I find fascinating. In your discussion board, the 4th question refers to linguistic relativism and asks a few questions, especially if you speak multiple languages, it might be something of interest for you to consider. Your textbook then goes on to the impact of language and talks about the importance of naming, the importance of identity, the way that we associate with others and place emphasis on our names. So your textbook talks about when we name our children, the way that we pay attention and we take thought into their names and how those names may shape how that person identifies. And then your textbook talks about affiliation and the way that we create solidarity with others through our language, and that we understand and bond with other people by the way that we use syntax, by the way that we speak grammatically, and by our lexicon, by our word choices. The idea of convergence is when we adapt our speech to meet other people's. So when we mirror the language of other people, then this shows convergence. So when my in-laws come to visit, my husband drops down into a southern type of accent, and it's very southern, and it converges with the language of his family. Divergence is when we emphasize the differences in language and we say, oh, this group is different than another group based on the differences. Your textbook on page 148 says, for example, members of an ethnic group, even though fluent in the dominant language, might use their own dialect as a way of showing solidarity with one another, a sort of we're proud of our heritage strategy. The same can occur across age lines, such as teens who adopt slang of subcultures other than their own to show divergence or I'm not like you with adults and convergence with another group. When we look at convergence and divergence, you might also look at the way that it impacts you on your job. And on page 148, it talks about swearing on the job. And it's interesting because people who work in different industries, different things are considered acceptable. And based on that, you create that convergence or divergence with your office affiliates. When we look at power and politeness, it's important to recognize that politeness is a less forceful approach at communicating in ways that save face for both the senders and the receivers, so that we help them to maintain face, we help them to maintain dignity. On the other hand, a powerless mannerism is a way that we show that we don't feel secure in something that we're saying. It could be through a hedge, and a hedge example would be, I guess we should. A hesitation, well, we could try this. A polite form might be to say, excuse me. Tag questions, don't, if you say a statement and then you add, well, don't you think, or do you think that would work? And your inflection on your voice tends to go up because you're asking a question. Sometimes people don't even, it's interesting, people can use their tone of voice to create tag questions where normally a tag question wouldn't be, just by saying they can create tag questions. Don't you think? Disclaimer, I probably shouldn't say this, or I probably should say this first. I want to make sure that you understand. And a lot of times these types of language can detract from the emphasis that you're trying to place. And a highly assertive culture using powerless statements can reduce the respect that a person has. When we look at the impact of language, we're going to look at this text from Purity in Language by Douglas Hofstadter. And I have to try to figure out how to best portray this since we're not in a classroom atmosphere. But usually what I do is I have students read this excerpt from Douglas Hofstadter, and then they talk about what it really means and what it stands for. So be patient with it. And here we go. Purity in language. Most of the clamor, as you certainly know by now, revolves around the age-old usage of the noun white and words built from it, such as chair white, male white, repair white, clergy white, middle white, French white, for white, white power, white slaughter, one-up white ship, straw white, white handle, and so on. The Negrists claim that using the word white, either on its own or as a component to talk about all the members of the human species, is somehow degrading to blacks and reinforces racism. Therefore, the Liberals propose that we substitute person everywhere where white now occurs. Sensitive speakers of our tongue, of course, find this preposterous. There is great beauty to a phrase such as, all whites are created equal. Our four bosses who framed the Declaration of Independence well understood the poetry of our language. Think how ugly it would be to say, all persons are created equal, or all whites and blacks are created equal. Besides, as any school whitey can tell you, such phrases are redundant. In most cases, it is self-evident when white is being used in an inclusive sense, in which case it subsumes members of the darker race just as much as fairskins. So, usually, I ask my students, what do you think this excerpt, and it is a much longer essay, but what do you think it means? Usually they answer something to the effect of, well, this person must be very racist. All of the white and black and the word racism. But what if I told you that this has absolutely nothing to do with race, but it's really dealing with something else? What would you think that it could be about? Have you ever seen words like chair white, male white, for white, white power? Have you ever heard the phrase, all whites are created equal? This excerpt is really all about sexism. Change those words. Chairman, mailman, a foreman, manpower. All men are created equal. Now, of course, if this had to do with racism, if it was really all to do with how white is so much better, and look at this last sentence. In most contexts, it's self-evident when white is being used in an inclusive sense, and it subsumes members of the darker race just as much as fairskins. And we say, oh, that's crazy, and how could you say that? Because obviously, white doesn't include other races. But we can substitute the word man, and we think that that's okay because it's always been done, and men can be used in an inclusive sense. It also means women. All man, well, that includes women, right? But I can guarantee you that any of the men who are listening to this, they wouldn't say that if we changed the word to women, all women are created equal, that they would consider themselves to be one of the women. So when it goes one way, but it doesn't go the other, then it means that we are subsumed, but not really included. Now, you may think that this is just semantics, but if words create thoughts and words relay thoughts, and if we have this idea that we are bound by the language that we speak, then perhaps we should consider sexism in our language. Sexist language includes words, phrases, and expressions that unnecessarily differentiate between females and males or exclude, trivialize, or diminish either sex. But oftentimes, when we refer to sexist language, we're specifically referencing cases where there is not that gender neutrality and women are subsumed. So instead of saying a mailman, we often say a letter carrier, a male person perhaps, but letter carrier I think is the preferred term. Instead of saying a chairman, we would say a chairperson. Instead of saying a stewardess or a steward, we say flight attendant. And in these ways, we try to avoid the idea of sexist language, and we consider gender neutrality. So gender-neutral language encourages the use of gender-neutral terms to create semantic equality in the workplace. The semantic equality is necessary for us to change our pattern of thought and for us to agree and understand that any gender or either gender would be acceptable in different levels of position. Gender-neutral language is important for 4 reasons. 1, there is a relationship between language use and social inequality, and if we can change the way that we use language, perhaps we can create more social justice. Secondly, using a specific language and avoiding the sexist language creates an idea of an unambiguous language. We are referencing specifically he or she, or when it's neutral, allowing that ambiguity to be present on purpose. So we're not assuming that just because it says chairman, that the person is that we understand better that it's a chairman, a chairwoman, or a chairperson. Number 3, it's sensitive to others, because maybe you don't worry about it. Maybe you're not concerned, but there are plenty of people who are and who feel that there needs to be greater social equality through language use. And finally, it's contemporary. It's what's being done now. And so it's important for us to consider gender-neutral language for that reason. Of course, racist language classifies members of a racial group as superior and others as inferior. And your textbook talks further about racist language on page 152. Not all language that might have racist overtones is deliberate. For example, connotations of words may favor whites over people of color, and it provides an example of that on page 152. And then we have the idea of reappropriation. Reappropriation is the use of particular words and the reclaiming of that term where it was once considered offensive, now it's acceptable. So an office girl. But we may call ourselves girls as in it's girls' night out. Or we may not think of it in a negative sense. The word geek. If we are calling ourselves geeks, if you're very technical and good with computers, you might call yourself a geek. But if somebody else calls you that, then it may not be considered acceptable. And you can see the language reappropriation oftentimes whenever there's been a suppressed group or a group marginalized, when they choose to claim that word as their own. So someone on the outside may not feel comfortable with that word, but someone within a particular culture or group feels comfortable and fine with that word. The word queer for a long time was considered a very offensive word, but that word queer has been reappropriated by certain groups and it's considered acceptable within those groups. When we consider verbal messages, we often look at clarity and ambiguity, and there is an abstraction ladder on page 155. Ambiguous language consists of words and phrases that have more than one commonly accepted definition. Ambiguous language can be very amusing. It can be funny whenever we have multiple intents through our ambiguity. Very clear language, or things that are specific and lower on the abstraction ladder, mean that they are concrete and that they're very direct. Equivocal terms are words that have more than one meaning, and they're often ambiguous. Relative words are words that derive meaning from their relationship to other terms, and they are also ambiguous. So, an equivocal term, I could say something and it could be interpreted in multiple ways. And a relative word would be like if I said, I need you to return my dress soon. Someone borrowed it. I need you to return it soon. Soon derives meaning based on how I interpret it, and it's relative to my understanding of the word soon. But we may need some greater clarity, or it may need to be more specific for you to know when I expect the dress returned. Instead of saying soon, which is equivocal or relative, I could say, I need the dress returned tomorrow morning. And then it becomes much more concrete and much more specific. When we're looking at the abstraction ladder that's found on page 155, on one side of things where there's a high level of abstraction, things are very broad. For example, you need to have a better attitude. And moving down that abstraction ladder, we can become very specific and very concrete. You need to complain less about working on weekends. One of those things, you need to have a better attitude, is vague. It could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. But the bottom, the low-level abstraction, you need to complain less about working on weekends. You're likely to receive a better feedback and response if you provide that much directness. Your textbook talks about gender and language starting on page 162 and continuing through page 164. Men tend to use report talk that focuses on information, facts, and knowledge and competence. They claim attention, assert position, establish status, use a lot of I language, and they use that language instrumentally to get things done. They may offer advice or solve problems, use short and declarative sentences, and they control the topic to show dominance in the conversation. Women, when using language, often have rapport talk, or they try to create connections, establish goodwill, show support, build community when they use language. Women tend to use language expressively instead of instrumentally, and it's used to build support and express emotion. Oftentimes, women have a tentative nature when using language and include hedges, disclaimers, apologies, or tag questions. And finally, instead of trying to show dominance and topic control, women tend to use conversation to initiate conversation and use conversation as maintenance, often through the use of question and listening noises. So if you're curious about more of that, you can look on pages 162 to 164. Your textbook also includes some information about social media and language, and you can reference your text for online usage.